Дорогие друзья, здравствуйте, спасибо, что вы пришли.
Good evening, dear
сегодня.
friends. Thank you for coming.
Я рад представить нашего
And
гостя
I'm very
Джейсона
happy
Мура,
to introduce our guest,
географа,
Jason
историка
Moore,
окружающей
who is a
среды,
historian
профессор
and
социолога
geographer.
университета Бinghamton,
He is a professor of sociology at
и
Binghamton
координатора
University.
исследовательской сети «Мир
He
экологии».
is a coordinator of research
World
network
Ecology.
World Ecology.
Именно мир экологии, а не мировой
So
экологии.
it's
Можно было
the
подумать,
world
с первого
ecology,
взгляда, может быть, потому
even
что
though
World
sometimes
Ecology
there are different associations with
образована
this
по аналогии с
word
известным
expression,
термином Валерстайна «мир-система».
because this is developed like Valerie Stein
И
term,
Джейсон первый раз в России.
the system.
И
And Jason is the first time in Russia.
И я супер рад, что это произошло.
And I'm very happy
Что Джейсон
that he
приехал
made
не
it here.
только прочитать эту лекцию, но он
And Jason
приехал
didn't come only to give
в
this
летнюю
lecture,
школу,
but
пространственное
he
письмо исследования антропоцена, где
is
он
going
будет
to
с нами
take
несколько
part
дней.
in
вести
our
семинары.
summer school, and
И
it's
после этого, я
called
надеюсь,
Earth and
появится
Writing,
первая
a study of the
публикация Джейсона на
Anthropocene,
русском.
and then hopefully
И
we'll get the
мы
first publication
будем
by
в
Jason in
дальнейшем
Russian.
сотрудничать.
And I hope that
И
we will collaborate
Джейсон
in the
станет
future,
частым гостем
and
в
Jason
России.
will become a frequent guest and frequent visitor to Russia.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Nikolai and Anna for making my visit possible and making this first trip to Russia a reality. I am thrilled to be here. I have just had a very provocative conversation and teaching this afternoon with the students, and I am looking forward to doing more tonight. So this is a lecture really about how do we think about capitalism, about the planet, about climate change in the 21st century. And what I want to propose is that we need to break fundamentally with the modern worldview of man, humanity versus nature, as if these are two separate entities, that humans are, of course, part of nature, and everything that humans do, building families, building communities, making empires, running financial systems, those are all part of nature too. Some of them we might approve of more than others. And so this is really a talk about how do we think our way through the present climate crisis in a way that advances justice for humans and for all of life, and that asks about sustainability and justice in the same breath. And so we're going to do a little history, a little political economy, we're going to do some philosophy, and we're going to mix all of these up so that by the end we can perhaps have some ideas that will allow us, as we move forward beyond this evening, to ask some really generative, useful questions and break out of the modern environmentalist paradigm, which is, I submit, an ecology of hopelessness. What I would like to see is us move towards an ecology of hope. So we have three big ideas, three big ways of framing the history of our times. One of them is Holocene, which for the geologists means recent era. For the geologists, 12,000 years is a recent era. The Anthropocene, which means age of humans, and the Capitalocene, which means age of capital. So we're going to walk through these one by one. So for the Holocene, we are now living through the end of it. The Holocene is a 12,000-year era of relative climate stability that is also the era of civilization, settled agriculture, states, and all the rest. This is the breaking point between prehistory and the history of civilization. This era is now over, as you can see. That long era of relative climate stability is over. And I want to suggest that the end of the Holocene which is what Earth system scientists call a state shift, that is, a fundamental, rapid, and irreversible transition in the climate system, calls for an intellectual state shift. That is, it calls for a revolution in ways of seeing, ways of knowing, ways of representing, ways of storytelling about the relations of humans with and within webs of life. And to make this argument challenges directly the idea that here is a science of nature and over here is a science of man. It directly confronts that, and as we will see, I want to call for a different paradigm, one in which humans and the rest of nature, human organizations of justice and injustice, of equality and inequality, of sustainability and unsustainability, are always with and within the web of life. This means that we need to move beyond the idea that humans and nature are like billiard balls, crashing into one another. The relation is much messier, more complex, but I think also much more hopeful. This is the philosophical basis to move beyond man and nature to a relational and dialectical view of power and life-making and environment-making. This alternative allows for an ecology of hope. So here's a key lesson from the Holocene that we don't normally take very seriously. We don't normally talk about because there is such an ecology of hopelessness. Ruling classes are extremely vulnerable to major shifts in climate. Now, when I say major shifts, I mean shifts in climate within that very narrow band of the Holocene. Bear with me, I'll flip back to remind you. Whoops, there we go. You see the blue. That's the narrow band of the Holocene. The climate shifts that lay ahead are much more significant. But even in that narrow blue band, whenever the climate shifts in the northern hemisphere, becomes much colder, often wetter as well, but not necessarily, you have very, very significant eras of political destabilization and civilizational crisis. This was true for the end of Roman power in Western Europe in the 5th and 6th centuries. It was true for feudalism in the 14th century. And the era of the Little Ice Age, which extends from the year 1300 to 1850, the worst, most intense moment of the Little Ice Age in the 17th century was the moment of a profound political and economic crisis all across Eurasia, from Paris to Beijing. So moments of climate change are moments of political possibility. That doesn't mean everything turns out very easily. It doesn't mean that everything turns out nicely, but it does mean that moments of climate shift are moments of political possibility. And we want to keep that in mind. Now, here's the other thing, that although there is nothing predetermined about such climate crises and the political crises that come from them, often in the history of Western and Central Europe, this has been a story of the collapse of empire and the resurgence in the livelihoods and well-being of the vast majority. So the collapse of Roman power in Western Europe, for instance, ushered in a golden age for peasants across Western and Central Europe. Similarly, 1,000 years later, in the long 14th century, the crisis of feudalism, which was a convergence of climate and disease, but also class revolt as workers and peasants revolted against feudalism. This era led to 150 years of very high living standards for peasants and workers across Western and Central Europe. So it's important to remember that these are moments of political possibility that accompany the disruption of business as usual for a civilization when the climate changes, because climate is important not just for the conditions of crisis, but also for the conditions of emergence of a civilization. So that means we are looking for ways to go beyond man and nature. The issue of climate shifts and political crises is not one billiard ball hitting another. It is a moment of entanglement in which climate is always present in the relations of empires, of economies, of cultures. There is no such thing as a culture without climate conditions. So bear with me as we walk through these ideas. So the Anthropocene, the age of man, is really a tale of two Anthropocenes. One is the geological Anthropocene, and this is a discussion and a research agenda around golden spikes in the geological layer. So in other words, what would an archaeologist or a geologist 100 million years from now be able to see in the geological layer? And the answer are nuclear residues from atomic testing, chicken bones, and plastics. Lots and lots of plastic. So this is the great accomplishment of modernity. Nukes, chicken bones, plastics. And this geological and geophysical Anthropocene is about, for example, rising carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. This is absolutely necessary and important as part of the story. But if we leave it with charts like this, or with charts like this, these are, you see these all the time, these are the hockey stick charts of the Anthropocene that give you a sense of water use, for instance, carbon dioxide concentrations, population, and all the rest. If you leave it at this, you have an ecology of hopelessness, because this tells you about consequences, but it tells you nothing about the causes and the conditions and the relations of power and production that made this possible. There's a second Anthropocene. That's the popular Anthropocene, and it basically says this: we have met the enemy, and he is us. This is an iconic poster from the first Earth Day in 1970. And this is a very, very powerful statement that many of my colleagues, many of my students, they believe it very strongly. I'm going to suggest that this might be part of the problem. I'm not sure that that's the right way to look at it. The first Earth Day was in 1970. And this is another iconic photograph from almost the exact same moment. This is Napalm Girl in Vietnam. This is a result of the American terror bombings in Vietnam. Terror bombings is a word, a phrase coined by an American Air Force general from World War II. And this makes little sense. We have met the enemy and he is us when we are dealing with the question of imperial war. And imperialist war has been one of the major causes of devastation, not just to human life, but to all life over the past century. And who is we anyway? So we have to ask this question, which is fundamental to the environmentalist paradigm. Who is we? For modern environmentalism, we was literally everyone. This was a way to avoid talking about something deeply central to the times of the early 1970s and late 1960s. When the United States sponsored the first United Nations Environmental Conference in Stockholm in 1972, there were two words that could not be uttered: Vietnam War. The American devastation of Vietnam War was the historical experience that gives us a terrible word: ecocide. So to kill nature, ecocide, comes out of this experience. For Richard Nixon, environmentalism and saving nature was a common cause of all the people of this country. Richard Nixon writes this at a moment when he has decided to increase the bombing of Southeast Asia on an unimaginable scale. He writes this at a moment when the universities, when the cities are in open revolt, when there are major movements in basic industry to challenge not only the existing managers, but also the labor unions themselves. This is a moment of profound revolt and instability in American society, but of course in the world as a whole. So when we use this word anthropogenic climate change, we want to be aware of what it says and what it does, and perhaps the unintentional politics that it implicates. So we can see here headlines. We could pick these kinds of headlines almost any day. Humans are causing climate change. I want to suggest that this is a way of blaming the poor, blaming the 99%, and of the 1% saying, well, you know, it's not our responsibility. It's all of us together. And so I argue for a geological Anthropocene. Yes, there is a relation between humans and the rest of nature on planet Earth in an extremely general sense. But there is also a geohistorical moment that includes the geophysical, but says that relations of power and empire and capital accumulation are also fundamental to the era of crisis that we're in. So when we say anthropogenic climate change, we might ask, is it really made by humans or is it capitalogenic? Here is a nice map where you can see the size of countries based on the 100 corporations that are responsible for about 70% of carbon dioxide emissions in the world today. This is one of many possible representations. I'll give you another. This is the historical disparity taken from the World Resources Institute between the carbon dioxide emissions between 1850 and 2012. You can see the United States and Europe are at the very top. Russia isn't even close. China is very large, but let's remember, much of China's carbon dioxide emissions have been underwritten by foreign capital, and their products are sent to the United States and the European Union. So let's be careful of saying, well, everyone's responsible. Well, everyone is not responsible. And it seems to me that the first step towards an effective politics of justice is to identify the agents of injustice. So we have these two Anthropocenes, the geophysical or geological Anthropocene and the popular Anthropocene. And this difference is very important to make clear because the popular Anthropocene is an argument about the causes of the geological Anthropocene. And the arguments from the popular Anthropocene are the same old environmentalist arguments that have been repeated time and again over the past 50 years. Too many people, which always means too many brown people, and evil technology, but at the same time, somehow technology will come to save us all. So the popular Anthropocene is a way of thinking about natural limits and the crisis of the earth that robs the idea, that robs from limits the question of history. It takes history out of the discussion. And as soon as we take history out of the discussion, then we are left with the impossibility of change. This is the real problem at the core of Malthusian and neo-Malthusian discussions of overpopulation and resource scarcity. They are not historical. Ultimately, they go back to an argument about human nature. So the popular Anthropocene is dangerous for another reason. It ultimately gives hope to one strategy only, which is geoengineering. Now, some form of geoengineering will almost certainly be necessary. But the popular Anthropocene is an anti-politics machine. And by anti-politics machine, it seeks to erase political questions of power, justice, democracy, and put them into a technological fix. So here I quote the longtime New York Times reporter Andrew Refkin saying, inevitably, geoengineering will occur. Now, I think he's right at one level. The question is, what kind of technology? Will it be authoritarian technology, or will it be democratic and appropriate technology? Finally, we get to the Capitalocene, the age of capital. And this is not an argument about capitalism as an economic system. This is an argument that says, yes, capitalism is indeed a civilization, a world ecology committed to endless capital accumulation, but there's more to the story than that. So this is an argument that says capitalism is a dialectically bound system that links questions of power and domination, production and reproduction, and the web of life at every turn. So it is a world within the biosphere, but porous and permeable. And it is dependent on cheap natures at every turn. Now, as we'll see, cheap natures means not only cheap food, cheap energy, cheap raw materials, it also means cheap human labor, paid and unpaid. And historically, that's meant overwhelmingly the unpaid work of women, nature, and colonies. So the end of the Holocene gives us a moment to start to connect and entwine the geophysical and the geohistorical as part of an evolving totality, in which it becomes possible to take effective action around the climate crisis. Now, the climate changes will continue regardless of what any of us do in this room. The sea levels will rise radically and rapidly. The weather will become less predictable. There will be more frequent droughts, more and more frequent episodes of extreme rainfall. There will be a whole series of geophysical, biospheric realities that we will have to address. The question is, do we engage climate crises in a more democratic, just, and sustainable way, or in a less democratic and sustainable way? So for me, I draw very heavily on a relational and dialectical tradition of Marx. Most people don't read Marx anymore as if he is a quaint 19th century figure. And while I don't think Marx was right about everything, I do think that some of his insights were powerful. So one of the things that he does when he talks about human labor is he says there is an extraordinary threefold movement, that human nature acts upon external nature, and in doing so changes the very meaning and character of work, changes at the same time the very character and substance of the rest of nature. He uses this term, external nature, or the rest of nature, and repeatedly emphasizes that labor is itself a specific natural force. And if we take that seriously, what is true for the work process is also true for the history of empires, of financial markets, of industrializations, and everything else. Now, what the Capitalocene allows us to do in moving beyond the purely economic, while recognizing the economic, is it understands that the great divide between rich and poor in the world today, remember, 8 men, own more wealth than the bottom 3.6 billion people on this planet. That's the climate class divide. But the climate class divide isn't a purely economic process. Indeed, economic processes and class processes are always dependent on the exercise of power and ideology and culture. So fundamental to the present moment is the linkage of the climate class divide, the climate patriarchy, and climate apartheid. And that's a crucial linkage if we want to build a radical and emancipatory politics of climate justice in the present. So we have one crisis with 2 faces. We have this moment of rising carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas concentrations, and we have a crisis of profit making. So we have a crisis of life making with climate change, mass extinction, and a crisis of profit making with the end of cheap natures, the end of cheap food, labor, energy, and raw materials. So here I'm going to give you just a sense of this. Here we have back here is the geophysical representation. We need to put this picture and pictures like it, the hockey stick charts, together with these, which are some version of the hockey stick charts, but for capitalism as a whole. So we need to look at a long-term decline in the world rate of profit, at the ongoing stagnation of labor productivity. This has been going on since the 1970s. The world is not capitalism is not automating labor, not on a scale sufficient to advance labor productivity. There is a long-term stagnation in world cereal production that is linked not only to the climate crisis, but also to the chemical herbicide fertilizer stagnation of modern agriculture, and also to social movements like La Via Campesina and food justice movements across the world. And finally, there is the rising mass of accumulated capital. So if you wonder why billionaires are still sinking millions and millions of dollars into real estate in Hong Kong and Manhattan and Miami and probably Moscow, it's because there are very few opportunities to sink your capital into a profitable investment. The massive capital continues to rise, and the opportunities to invest that capital continue to shrink, which is a dynamic not only of the class struggle, but also of the climate crisis in multiple senses of that term. So when we look at these pictures, there tend to be two responses. One is to say, well, this is a crisis, but we faced crises before. And another is to say, oh my God, this is the end of the world. I think in a different way, those questions make sense, but we have to be very clear about them. For me, the question is this a developmental crisis? That is, a crisis like the Great Depression of the 1930s, or the Great Depression of the late 19th century, or the Great Depression of the middle 16th century. Each of those were developmental crises, very serious, which were resolved within the context of capitalism. Or is it an epochal crisis of capitalism, and one in which new modes of producing and reproducing life and power and environments and wealth will emerge? So what kind of capitalism? Is this capitalism as a social system that merely interacts with nature, or is it a more dynamic and dialectical movement of environment making in which capitalism is not only a producer of changes in the web of life, but is also a product of those changes? So remember Marx on the labor process. The worker changes external nature, and in so doing is changed by that process. So it's very important that we keep in mind these two different models. One is a model of constant flow and reshaping of producer and product. The other is man versus nature. That's the billiard ball model. So this gives us a moment to think about the kinds of models, the kinds of cosmologies that we use to make sense of the crisis today. And sometimes that means we need to turn inside out our typical thinking. So as environmentalists, we often think about what the modern world, maybe it's the states, maybe it's an industrial factory, maybe it's an empire. We think about those entities doing terrible things to the web of life. And that's true. But capitalism doesn't work because it does terrible things to life. It does do terrible things to life. Capitalism works because it transforms webs of life into profit-making machines, and it does so by going beyond the boundaries of capitalism. As we'll see, capitalism is always looking to go to the frontier, to frontiers where the money relation does not dominate, and those are places where power and violence and some technology can be used to extract cheap labor, food, energy, land, and raw materials. So what I want to suggest is if we want to understand the politics of climate justice, of planetary justice, we need to understand how capitalism puts nature to work. That includes, of course, human nature. And that means that we look at a question of cheapness. Now, cheapness has two meanings in English. One is an economic meaning, so cheap in price, low price. It turns out that capitalism needs low price food, energy, raw materials, and land because it is so expensive to work. We think of capitalism as very efficient. It is indeed the precise opposite. That's why every new industrial expansion in the modern world has been accompanied by new imperialisms. But cheapness has another meaning in English, which is to treat with less respect, to degrade, to disrespect. To cheapen something is to culturally degrade something. To cheapen women's work is to rob it of respect. And that in that sentence, you can see the deep relation between a binary of nature and civilization and man and woman. And that is something that took shape at first in the 16th and 17th centuries. So Marxist thought also has its problems, which is it tends to imagine the growth of capitalism as somehow centered on the cash nexus, the money form itself. So the typical model is something like this, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and all of that. In fact, what's necessary is for the cash nexus, this getting bigger and bigger, to go along with appropriation, the appropriation of the unpaid work of human natures, overwhelmingly of women, and the unpaid work of extra-human natures, the rest of nature. So soils work, forests and plants and non-human animals work. That constitutes the socially necessary unpaid work that is the basis for modern capitalism, governed by the law of value and socially necessary labor time. And you can see the disproportion. For every dollar or every ruble of exploitation in paid work, there has to be that much more unpaid work of human and extra-human natures. So in short, capitalism booms when there are islands of commodity production and exchange within oceans of potentially cheap nature. And fundamental to every great boom, every great economic expansion in the modern world has been the drive towards frontiers through empire and the restoration of the four cheaps: labor, food, energy, and raw materials. These take different forms in every era. They could be cotton from the American South in the late 19th century, worked by African slaves. It could be Persian Gulf oil in the 1960s and 70s. It could be peasantries rapidly and radically expropriated. So this, in fact, is how capitalism tends to develop. A small amount of money, of capital, in concert with states and empires and cultures of domination, moves out into the frontiers and then booms. So you can see, if we take the last 50 years or so, 45 years perhaps, of neoliberalism, you can see that the frontiers rapidly collapse. In an era of climate change, the frontiers do not merely get smaller, they completely turn inside out. Climate change essentially takes nature, which has always been a source of reducing costs, into its completely opposite state of being. It is a state shift, as the climate scientists talk about the climate system. So nature moves from something that reduces costs to something that maximizes costs, because climate change makes everything more expensive, especially agriculture, which is the whole basis of the modern world. So now we can take the last half of this talk to very, very quickly go through this history of capitalism as a system of cheap nature. And one of the things I want us to keep in mind is that we are living in multiple historical periods that have not ended. So let me explain what that means as we go through here. When I give talks across Latin America and in the United States, I often say 1492 is not over. And that's readily understood because the long-term processes of genocide, of the racialization of empire and class, of environmental devastation that attended the invasion and conquest and commodification of the Americas, that era never ended. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't other eras that started at the same time. So we are living simultaneously in the era of 1492, of 1830, with the dominance of steam engines in English industry, and in perhaps 1945, or pick your favorite moment, historical marker. So we are living in a long era of capitalist development in which 1492 has not ended. And here's the other thing, that our English language words, and it looks different, but is roughly the same for other Western European languages. I would imagine the periodization is very different for Russian. But between 1550 and 1650, in English, the words society, European, civilization, savage, all enter into the language in their contemporary form between 1550 and 1650. And let me underscore that these are not just words. These are ways of organizing reality. And I would remind you that every time a European empire reached a new land, it reclassified the inhabitants of those lands as savages, as not part of civilization, as not fully human, as part of nature. Now, why is that? Well, there are a lot of reasons for that, and it's a complicated story. But at the bottom of it is that to treat them as nature allowed the empires and the capitalists and the planters and the bankers to treat those human beings in the lands on which they lived cheaply, the better to turn a tidy profit. So this is a pivotal era, not just in English capitalism, but in the history of world capitalism. It's also an era of climate crisis. And it's whenever you have major changes in the climate, as you did in the early 17th century especially, you have a major escalation of social conflict and social transformation. One of my favorite examples is that of the English in Ireland, where they rapidly and radically dispossess the Irish of their lands in the period between 1640 and 1700. The Irish were not human beings to the English. They were savages. They were wild. In Peru, in the 17th century, the Spaniards called indigenous Peruvians naturales, part of nature. So you can see here that these are not just words. These are not just ideas floating out here. These ideas become real abstractions, powerful abstractions that are quite conscious and deliberate and powerful tools of empire. These are forces of dispossession. So, nature with a capital N, nature in the sense of nature versus civilization, nature is a class struggle. It is a colonial struggle. There is a process and a project of going on in the modern world. There is a process of the web of life, which is messy and contentious and complicated and lives in us and through us and beyond us. And there is a project of capitalist modernity to turn webs of life into profit-making machines, into cheap natures. So, as I mentioned, everywhere, women, slaves, Slavs, Celtic peoples, indigenous peoples, peasants almost everywhere were redefined as part of nature. They were either not human or not fully human, not ready for civilization. Of course, after 1945, that discourse gets reinvented around the category of development. You're developed, you are not developed. And as anti-imperialist critics in the 60s emphasized, there is no such thing. There is development of the rich, there is overdevelopment and underdevelopment. So this is nature and civilization as a cosmology that is also a real abstraction. A real abstraction is an idea that we treat as real, as fundamental, as eternal. So nature is one example. Race is another. Race is heavily binarized, white, not white. Gender is another. We know there are many more than two genders, but in the modern world, there's only man and woman. These all go together. And this is part of a praxis of recreating the world around this either or logic, around this violent and abstract opposition. So here you can see that in the rise of capitalism, and this continues, but in revised form today, that most human beings were not only pushed off their lands or killed outright, but dispossessed of their humanity. It's not, for instance, that women were equal in medieval society, but women had a place in public assemblies, for instance, in Western Europe. They did not in capitalist Europe. So this is very, very important to keep in mind that capitalism is an economic system, but it is an economic system that works through domination, extra economic domination. So here is just a map of the rise of capitalism and how this works out. This is important because if we want to understand what to do about the climate crisis today, we need to understand when it began. If we believe that it started in England with the steam engine and coal, then we will have a very, very different politics of climate justice than if we understand that these causal processes and relationships began in the 16th and 17th centuries. And if we fail to see the earlier period, we will also fail to see, as I will show in just a moment, that the English Industrial Revolution was not driven by the steam engine. It was not driven by the steam engine. It was not driven by coal. It was driven by African slaves working on the Mississippi Delta, growing a variety of cotton, hirsutum, that had been developed by indigenous peoples over hundreds of generations. So there you have the unpaid work of indigenous peoples, the unpaid work of African slaves, the unpaid work of the soils that formed the fundamental condition for British industrialization. And of course, the British also needed cheap Russian iron from the Urals, worked by not slave labor, but serf labor. And that may be, as we say, a distinction without a difference. We can talk about that. So you see how we need to look at the relations of power around gender and race and empire and class as they infuse this process and permeate this process of endless capital accumulation. Now, why is this so important? Well, because capitalism is not efficient. It is indeed the most wasteful and inefficient system we could possibly imagine. And so in order to sustain the capitalist model, there had to be a way of moving to the frontier and securing cheap labor, energy, raw materials, and food at every point. So remember this. Here is the secular decline in the rate of profit. Now, this is usually taken, including by this is assumed by Marxist economists to be an economic chart and not an ecological chart. In fact, it is both. And that we can only understand the crisis of accumulation in the world by understanding how climate and capital accumulation and new relations of production are all fitting together. And we'll keep going through here. So in other words, cheap nature in this line of man and nature was a fundamental force of primitive accumulation. That is, it was a productive force in its own right. And you can see here, these are just maps on one theme, on a common theme, that the rise of capitalism was very much premised on global conquest. But that didn't stop in 1700. In fact, with the industrial revolutions of the early and late 19th centuries, there were new imperialisms, new forms of the world color line, new forms of global and globalizing patriarchy, new forms of the world class divide, that this process gets reinvented again and again and again. So this begs a question. What happens when there are no more frontiers of cheap nature? So here I'm going to flip through here, but I just want to remind you that the origins of this system come about with a geological watershed in the history of planet Earth, which is essentially restoring Pangea and putting the work and energy of two continents, North and South America, at the service of European empires, European financial markets, European industrialists at every turn. So this is not, this is not a story of the inventiveness of Europeans. It is a story of the backwardness of Europeans in the 15th and 16th century, and the movement to frontiers to find vast new sources of wealth that could be extracted and put to work readily. And to remind you that this is not just a process of economic development. This is a process of genocide and ecocide from the very beginning, and that every great era of capitalist development from the 16th century onwards brought forth new waves of genocide and new waves of ecocide. And this was not simply a process of disease somehow mystically killing off everyone. There was a disease moment to this, but the diseases were concentrated because every empire was seeking to mobilize the cheap labor of indigenous peoples and concentrating them into new villages and new village forms of village life. This long era is important for understanding climate crises today, because this culminates in the first great climate crisis of capitalism in the early 17th century. This the genocide of the American Indians led to the regrowth of forests, which absorbed carbon and reduced global carbon dioxide concentrations by 7 to 10 parts per million. This is what Lewis and Maslin call the Orbis spike, or the global spike. And this was a contributing moment to the severely cold winters and very cold summers of the early 17th century. So it's often also, people say, well, the level of environmental transformation was still very, very small. And there's truth to that, but between medieval Europe and early modern Europe, you have an order of magnitude shift. So order of magnitude is 10 times greater. And in my book, if something in say 12 or 1300 is at the level of 1, and then you look 300 years later and it's the level of 10 or 20, that is a big shift. And that's exactly what we see in northeastern France. In the 12th and 13th centuries, it took 200 years to clear 12,000 hectares of forest. In the 1650s, in Brazil, at the height of the sugar boom, 12,000 hectares were cleared in 1 year. So that is a radical shift. All right, so this is, of course, not just a moment of economic and ecological transformation, but it is also a moment at which ecology and economy are held together, not just by empire, but by the world color line. So the sugar frontier relied on slave labor. So the sugar frontier in the Americas, and you can see those arrows, the black arrows going out to the Atlantic and then going to Brazil, going to the Caribbean, you can see that it is also linked to a slaving frontier. So every great era of industrialization, and industrialization is really born in the sugar fields of Madeira and then Brazil. Every great industrialization requires a new labor frontier. So this was true. The United States was built on immigrant labor at 3 or 4 different key points. But when the United States becomes a world economic power, it is built on the economic basis of cheap immigrant labor from Southern and Eastern Europe. never mind African labor, enslaved African labor, and oppressed Chinese labor. So this is a moment at which agriculture, class, environment, and race all come together. And that is precisely the combination of factors that is coming together in an era of climate apartheid. So this was also a question of gender and the devaluing of women's work that I'm just going to move through very closely. It's not my discovery, but decades of feminist thinkers and writers emphasizing that capitalism is built on the unpaid work of women. And this was true from the beginning, even in narrowly economic terms, although the contributions were significantly higher than just economic. And indeed, proto-industrialization before the steam engine was a classic example of what has been called the second shift. That is, it took advantage of women's unpaid family labor, domestic labor, and then put them to work in spinning and weaving, but especially spinning in the 17th and 18th centuries. So, as I mentioned, this is a process by which the creation of the environmentalist paradigm was replicated, this movement that we see in the rise of capitalism, humans and nature, all right? And pardon me for a moment. And so it's very crucial that we keep this in mind as we think about the climate crisis as a moment of climate class divide, climate patriarchy, climate apartheid, in a moment of the end of the Holocene and the relative climate stability of the past 12,000 years. Here, I just want to emphasize that the Industrial Revolution, which is often viewed as the beginning of planetary crisis, does not begin in England, but finds its crucial dimensions in the expulsion of American Indians from the American South, and then the development of the cotton gin, which amplifies labor productivity by 50 times in the 1790s and leads to a resurgence of slavery called the Second Slavery, based on cheap American cotton. It was the fall in the price of cotton within England. Cheap American cotton came in and made possible the steam engine revolution. So what are the lessons from the 20th century? And here we will begin to wrap up. Here I'm going to be very selective to just paint a few pictures. I think the dominant imagination of climate crisis is an imagination of the apocalypse. Now, apocalypse literally means to lay bare, but I think apocalypse in the way that we tend to use it is synonymous with almost an obliteration or an oblivion that lies ahead. And I think it conjures up a kind of image from the past century that I think is in some unconscious way, largely unconscious, I would think, based on the 20th century experience of imperial war. And one of the very, I think, sad lessons of war in the 20th century is the willingness of the imperialist forces to destroy life and land and the forces of production. To save the village, we had to destroy it. That could almost be the motto of every imperial war in the 20th century. So that's worth reflecting on as we head into a climate crisis that promises to impose severe dislocations of life and livelihoods. And here are two pictures. One at the top is from New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The one on the bottom is from Puerto Rico, still a colonial possession of the United States, and it has been treated accordingly after Maria in 2017. Puerto Rico is still absolutely devastated. So we have to, I think, highlight the willingness on the part of the 1% across the world to allow unprecedented devastation as climate crises roll out with ever increasing intensity and frequency. Finally, we need to, when we look at the 20th century, we need to look at the history. Yes, this is one of those lovely Khrushchev era apartments there. But the Marshall Plan, the U.S. Eisenhower highway system, and many other places around the world, the history of especially the post-World War II era was one of state planning that changed merely in form, not in substance, after 1979 to 81. That when we look at the history of the 20th century, we can see the extraordinary, not just the extraordinary violence of centralized states like the United States. Of course, the Soviet Union was another centralized state, but nowhere close to the same scale as the United States, not a global empire in anywhere near to the same fashion. But we tend to forget that even in the richest countries and in the world superpower of the 20th century, state planning was pursued across the 1945 to was pursued relentlessly after 1945 and merely changed form. I mean, the George Bush, Cheney administration simply resurrected the planning state under the heading of a permanent war on terror. So the point is that in an era of climate crisis, nearly every city on a coastline on planet Earth will have to be moved. The water systems will have to be rebuilt. The housing will have to be rebuilt. The electrical systems will have to be rebuilt. So there are lessons here from earlier experiences that essentially built the fossil fuel infrastructure, especially the Marshall Plan after World War II in Western Europe. The largest item in the Marshall Plan budget was to convert Western Europe to oil, not coal. The Eisenhower interstate highway system was designed to create a fossil-fueled American capitalism. So this has already been done, the use of the state to radically reshape landscapes and lives and all the rest. The question is, how will it be used in an era of climate crisis? Will it be used in an authoritarian way or in a liberatory way? Of course, states without popular mobilization will never be anything but authoritarian. So we have to also look at the ways in which life and social reproduction can be reshaped from below in an era of climate crisis. Here we have snapshots from the extraordinary labor unrest in China that has been going on over the past decade, teachers' strikes in the United States, and food sovereignty movements across the world. Right, so the crucial task for climate justice has to be this. Maybe not only this, but in part this. It has to bring together the work of labor, of wage labor, the work of unpaid human work, overwhelmingly of women, and the work and life of the biosphere as a whole. How do we forge a politics that understands all of these are intimately connected and that justice for one will be impossible without justice for all? I think that's a crucial question after decades of jobs versus environment, development versus sustainability divides. We have to find a way to reinvent that conversation so that we can look for the political possibilities of a new synthesis that put the paid work of humans and the unpaid work of humans and the rest of nature together into a common political project. So what are the insights here as we wrap up? First, we have to be able to put together at least these four moments. One is the unfolding climate biodiversity crisis in a geophysical sense. Another is the unfolding geohistorical crisis of cheap nature, the end of cheap labor, food, energy, and raw materials. And we need to be able to keep in mind that as the amount of capital grows, it becomes more unstable, it becomes more volatile, financial crises become more likely, and the only way to resolve that is either to devalorize it, which would require massive political action, or to confront it or to put an end to capital accumulation itself. That we have a moment where the possibility of investing, accumulating we have a moment where the possibility of investing capital on a large scale is becoming narrower and narrower and narrower. Really, the Facebook platform revolution, Facebook platform capitalism revolution, in which the product is you, is in many ways the last gasp of securing the unpaid work of humans and the rest of nature. And then finally, we have an emergent system-wide crisis of social reproduction. This is not only a crisis of healthcare in places like the United States, of pensioners in places like Russia and all across the world, but it's also a crisis of what's often called climate apartheid and climate patriarchy, where overwhelmingly the effects of climate crisis are visited upon women across the global South. So this means we need a politics that puts together the questions of class, patriarchy, and apartheid in the climate crisis, to understand that the climate crisis is not one purely of greenhouse gases. It is how greenhouse gases entangle and enmesh and interpenetrate with class, patriarchy, apartheid, and global imperialism. So is this the end of the world, or is it the end of capitalism? Well, that's what we get to decide. My tendency is to look at history and see when ruling classes have survived climate crises. And if we ask the question, when have they survived? The answer is hardly ever have they survived. In the 17th century, Europe's ruling classes survive by moving to the tropics and establishing new slave, sugar, and colonial production regimes in the tropical zone of the world. Today, there's no escape from climate crisis, and as we know, the Arctic and the polar regions have been heating up the fastest of any place. So there's one sense in which history tells us that business as usual becomes impossible in eras of climate crisis. We also need to challenge the environmentalist paradigm, which says we have met the enemy and he is us. And I think that we need to look at that very, very carefully and very, very skeptically. For this reason, these are the crises over the past 2,000 years, that when the crisis turns unfavorable for a civilization, the civilizations enter into epochal crises. So in the long history of feudalism, which exists for about 500-600 years, it emerges during a relatively warm period. It booms during an even warmer period called the medieval warm period, and it falls into crisis at the beginning of the Little Ice Age. Now, it's not a simple story like climate causes this, but we have to remember that climate is fundamentally woven into the fabric of, in this case, of feudalism's class system, its political system, its agricultural system. So it's not a separate billiard ball crashing in to all of those social relations. It's already part of those social relations. And so when climate changes, everything comes unraveled. And that's important to keep in mind. And it's also important to keep in mind that systems don't fall absent popular revolt. But part of civilizations, part of capitalism is indeed the rising power of the producing classes and the reproducing classes. And so we should revisit this question. Is it today, are we living through a developmental crisis, or are we living through an epochal crisis? And in order to answer that question, we have to take history very seriously. And that is where environmentalism and environmental thought has been weakest. Marxist thought has been much better, but it has largely treated nature as epiphenomenal, as maybe one factor among many, which is a mistake as well. It's really the mirror image of the environmentalist mistake. So
what do we need for planetary justice? This is where we will close. First, we need to engage climate change geohistorically, not just geophysically, but geohistorically. We need to see how greenhouse gas molecules are fundamentally bound to capitalism as a system of cheap nature and its climate class divide, climate patriarchy, and climate apartheid. We need to make ontological demands, that is, fundamentally existential demands that challenge capitalism's business as usual, that put together decarbonization, democratization, and decommodification with demilitarization. So a different 4Ds. The Greens always leave out decommodification, and that's the center of the whole thing. And finally, and we need to say not degrowth, but a reinvention of what the good life means. As the Latin Americans say, what is buen vivir, the good life? And this goes especially for North American and European environmentalists. We need to decolonize our anti-communist environmental imaginaries. We can go into detail historically about this, but we should look at the experience of Cuba, China, the Soviet Union, and others to look at what are the experiences of reconstruction that were useful and helpful, and that were not useful and not helpful. And to dismiss these experiences, I think, is to rob us of a powerful set of experiences and lessons about how to reconstruct the world in an era of climate crisis, because there's no question that we'll need to reconstruct the world. So where does that leave us? First, emancipatory politics, climate justice politics has to stop drawing lines around whose work and whose lives matter and whose does not. We need to move beyond man versus nature to understand history and the politics of planetary justice in a relational and unified frame. We need to insist no politics of nature without work, no politics of work without nature. And finally, we need to insist that the politics of life and work can no longer be enclosed within nature and civilization. So to quote Thomas Munzer, the creatures too must become free. Thank you very much.
Спасибо. Вы можете задать вопросы.
Thank you very much. You can ask your questions now.
Здравствуйте, Джейсон.
Hello, Jason. Thank you very much for your lecture.
Меня зовут Дарья.
My name is Daria.
Хотела задать, вы сравниваете
You
отношения
compare the
природы и человека
relations
как игра в бильярд.
between nature and human as billiard balls.
И ясен всем
And
только что в
we
настоящем
know
мире
the result that it might cause the situation when no billiard balls stay on this table. So what kind of rules do you think this game should have if we speak about man and nature?
That's an excellent question. I think the first place we need to start is to break with man and nature. Man and nature is the imagination of the conqueror and the capitalist. So where should we go? Let me see if we can, it might take me a moment to flip all the way to the end. It's going to make me work a lot. But here's the fundamental idea. We are all part of nature. Okay. The invention of nature as outside and this as society and therefore not nature, that is an invention of the 16th and 17th century. It is a product of the conquest of the Americas and the intellectual, scientific, and economic revolutions of early capitalism. And it required not just this is the world color line. So Africans were monsters, and they were not human or not part of civilization in the thinking of the powerful. So we have to find a way to move beyond that. My proposal is relatively simple. We are all part of nature, which many of us are ready to accept. The organizations that we build as humans, an empire, a financial market, an industrial system, Those are relations of humans with each other and with the rest of nature. That helps us understand what I call the process of history, the process of capitalist history. And it helps us understand that nature can neither be saved nor destroyed. Our relationship with each other and with the web of life can be more just and more emancipatory and more sustainable or less. It's the relationship that can change. For me, that strikes me as a much more hopeful perspective, because if we understand that the given relations of the modern world are not eternal, but they are choices, and they are the fruits of conquest, we can understand that there is a politics to man and nature, and there is a politics towards a different way of living and being in the world. Most humans, all humans before the 16th century really saw themselves as part of the web of life in one way or another. So in medieval Europe, for instance, there was a conception of the great chain of being, and it was hierarchical. The king was at the top, and then God, way, way up there. But everyone was connected. That's not what we see in the capitalist era. So we need to look, they're really making me work here to get all the way back to the beginning here. But here we go. So instead of this is bad. This is the point of view of the conqueror. We need a view in which, yes, we change the web of life and the web of life changes us. So capitalism, socialism, industrialization, family relations, those are producers of the web of life, but they are also products of the web of life. And that's a way of speaking to the possibility of moving beyond capitalist alienation, of the separation, not just of the worker from the means of production, but of the human from her and his place in the web of life, in which it becomes a choice.
Thank you very much, Jason, for a very interesting talk. I was sitting here thinking about the concept of the frontier. So I'd like to highlight this concept. And I was also thinking about the outer space as the frontier. So I'm just wondering whether there is a room in your conceptualization for the outer space, or it's relevant because, it's not cheap, there's no cheap labor, and etc. So how would you conceptualize that?
It's a fantastic question, and it's an important one. As soon as the major frontiers of capitalism were fundamentally closed, right around 1970, that's when we see an explosion of science fiction writing around colonizing the stars. So even though the possibilities on planet Earth for frontier expansion were foreclosed, the imagination continues. And this is Elon Musk, right? Let's go to Mars. How great would that be? And it's the easy answer is what you already pointed to, which is that outer space is not a frontier in this sense, because it's the opposite of cheap. But it has been a frontier that's already been colonized over the past 4 decades. There are, somebody can correct me, well over 2,000 satellites orbiting the planet. And what do? They map. So that's a very, very much a 16th century invention. They're about global mapping, global positioning system, so GPS, which is run by the United States Air Force, by the way. And they're about information flows. So if you can speed up the flows of information, then that opens new profit-making opportunities. They have not been sufficient to counteract the ongoing stagnation of capitalism. And that ongoing stagnation of capitalism is now so evident that even leading neoclassical economists like Larry Summers, the terrible Larry Summers, the former chief economist for the World Bank, who said we should encourage the export of toxic goods to the third world. Larry Summers. Even Larry Summers says we're in the middle of a secular stagnation. So it's becoming increasingly clear, even to bourgeois economists, that the possibilities for the old growth model, those possibilities are now over. That means that business as usual under capitalism is going to go through a fundamental change, is already going through one. Trumpism is an example of that. That is climate policy, what Trump is doing around borders. And it's not, as we know from the European Mediterranean so-called refugee crisis, it's not the only example.
Еще вопросы есть у кого-нибудь? Thanks a lot. You mentioned that degrowth will not help us. Do you oppose the growth movement with its intention to slow or even to eliminate economic growth for the sake of ecology, or do you agree with them?
I'm very sympathetic to the spirit of degrowth because I think at its best, degrowth questions the very conception of growth. I think at its best, degrowth is not saying we need an end to growth, but we need an entirely new way of measuring and qualitatively appreciating the good life. I think the problem with movements is that they're messy and imperfect, and that's also the beautiful thing about movements. I'm largely unconvinced that degrowth as a political program has resonance outside of Central and Western Europe. I think that we need something that is that moves beyond ecology and economy. I think degrowth is part of a process that I think that degrowth is part of a process, a learning curve that is going on amongst social movements today. And I think at its best, climate justice, environmental justice, justice for migrants and calls for open borders, all of these movements are beginning to see how the question of work and social reproduction, not just gender equality, but also decommodifying healthcare, education, transportation. I think there's a learning curve that we're going through to begin to understand how all of these seemingly disconnected issues are in fact all coming together in an era of climate crisis. And we have to keep that perspective in mind. And in order to do that, we have to move beyond man and nature. Degrowth has not done that. In fact, they refuse to do that. But there are many people in degrowth movements who understand readily that ways of seeing matter fundamentally to our belief in political possibility. I think that on the one hand, we want to be very comradely towards all manner of social movements. Degrowth is one of them. On the other hand, we want to raise difficult questions to those movements.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Very good. Thank you very much.